Hello and welcome to episode 35 of Everything History, the Battle of Philippi, in which I will detail the finalized creation of the Second Triumvirate and the lead up to the Battle of Philippi between Octavian and Antony and Brutus and Cassius.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
I completed the previous episode with the unofficial formation of the Second Triumvirate by Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus. The date is now early autumn 43 BCE, and the younger Caesar is consul of Rome, and Antony has just recently collected the head of one of the late Caesar's assassins, Decimus Brutus Albinus. With his death, the western portion of the Roman Republic was now technically at peace, thanks to the political savviness of Octavian and the cooperation between the three powerful generals. So peace in the west was attained, but as it settled over the western lands, there was a recognizable uneasiness. Would the three generals turn against each other as their ancestors had many times before? Well, fearing such an unnecessary fate, the three generals decided to convene in a neutral location for a conference on how to manage the future of the Roman world. This was to be one of the most important and meaningful negotiations of the ancient world. The three decided to meet on the river Lavinius in northern Italia. Antony and Octavian both arrived with 5 legions and aligned themselves opposite to each other. Lepidus arrived with no such force. He was actually much more of a neutral party. The three then moved forward and met on a small island within the Lavinius River. Octavian and Antony both left a cohort of 300 men on opposite sides of the river, but the three commanders convened their negotiations alone. They discussed terms and conducted negotiations for 3 whole days. They ended the conference with a plan, a very large, multi-layered plan that would unfold over the next year. I won't keep their plan secret, although they certainly did, somewhat at least. The plan had Octavian resigning the consulship and having the assemblies of the people pass a law creating a new executive/magisterial office that all 3 of them would hold at the same time. This office was the office of Triumvirate, and it was to be a temporary position awarded to all 3 of them for 2 5-year terms, and the office carried all of the authority of a consul, while still allowing all worthy citizens to hold the consul seats as per usual. Such worthy citizens were to be chosen by the triumvirs, however, in order to maintain peace and, of course, control. Lepidus, Antony, and Octavian also decided how they would divide their authority so as not to overlap and contradict each other. Lepidus was to receive the province of Hispania, Antony Gaul, and Octavian received Africa, Sicily, and Sardinia. Italia itself was to be governed by all 3 of them and the Senate combined. This territorial separation was just a temporary settlement, however, for they did not intend to truly govern until they had won back control of the eastern Roman Mediterranean from the clutches of Brutus and Cassius. And of course, this settlement would mean nothing at all if they did not win their upcoming war. That being noted, they were fully aware of their predicament. The triumvirs were not delirious and held no misapprehensions about the uncertainty of the future. That being the case, they also decided in their settlement on a course of action, a wide and specific course with many objectives from politics to economics to military affairs. And to ensure these objectives, they decided Lepidus would rule as consul in Rome the following year and stay there to manage the affairs of the state, the western state that is. This was done to allow Octavian and Antony free rein to deal with the coming civil conflict in the east. To ensure peace in Rome, they decided to leave 3 legions as well, stationed with Lepidus, while Octavian and Antony would wield a whopping 20 legions apiece into war. That number is likely exaggerated. Appian tends to do this, and Plutarch rarely provides military commentary, so likely they both had not 20 legions, but somewhere between 8 and 12 legions apiece. Yet regardless of the exact size of their forces, it is a fact that the triumvirs needed one thing: money. Because for more than a year now, the taxes and tithes of the Roman East had been requisitioned by the conspirators Brutus and Cassius. This greatly damaged the finances and economic capability of the Roman West. Gaul had been bled dry by Caesar, and the civil wars had squandered the rest of the money. The only thing the West had going for it now outside of the considerable leadership of the triumvirs was the grain supplies from Africa. Nevertheless, with Brutus and Cassius amassing the wealth of Asia and the East, the triumvirs were in an economic bind. It was impossible for the Roman Republic's Western society to be able to pay the soldiers, conduct a massive civil war just as great as that between Pompey and Caesar, and maintain socio-economic integrity in Rome and the rest of the Republic at the same time. It was not possible given the current circumstances, so the triumvirs decided to change their circumstances by reinstating the vile proscriptions that had last been utilized by Sulla. The word prescription, not prescription by the way, needs to be defined here. The word is extremely old, hardly changed from the Latin verb proscribere. In the most innocent sense, the word in Latin and English means to publish or to advertise. The most common and more serious simply means to prescribe or to forbid. Yet none of these definitions apply perfectly to this scenario in 43 BCE under the triumvirs and the time of Sulla circa 86-88 BCE. Because in this sense, prescriptions are in fact lists of men that are prescribed or determined to die. And upon their deaths, their property and wealth is acquired by the state, to be sold at a later price. The killers are highly rewarded, and every Roman that protects the prescribed individuals, if caught, is as a consequence also guilty and therefore prescribed as well. In effect, these events were quite literally purges. In fact, solas are usually referred to as such. A young Julius Caesar was actually on such a list to die, but he had been spared by Sulla. Quite a fortuitous moment, I'd say. But anyways, you might be wondering about the legality of such prescriptions and who the people on the triumvirs list were, and of course, how many died. Many of the ancient historians do not cite a number, most in fact do not. It seems, though, that several thousand, at least over 2,000, died by means of the prescriptions of Octavian, Lepidus, and Antony. The people on these lists were not random people, they were the rich and powerful. Almost all were from the patrician or equestrian classes, some were the enemies of the triumvirs, but some were even close relatives to the triumvirs. It was a ruthless affair, and in regards to legality, it was legal because they had such authority as triumvirs. They also had the support of the soldiers and the people's assemblies, and the Senate would not, could not, and did not oppose them. There is, though, the question of morality. And on this, the ancient historians are unanimous. They all describe the prescriptions as horrible and despicable. For example, Plutarch said of this grim affair, quote, "Nothing, in my opinion, could be more savage or cruel than this exchange. For by this barter of murder for murder, they put to death those whom surrendered just as truly as those whom they seized. But their injustice was greater towards their friends whom they slew without so much as hating them." End quote. The most famous victim of the prescription hunting was Marcus Tullius Cicero, who Antony had killed not only for his money, but because Cicero had been such a great enemy to Antony in the past. Cicero's family was also wiped out as well, although Octavian did spare Cicero's son. And it was through these legal murders that the triumvirs readied themselves to fight Brutus and Cassius. If you would like more commentary on the prescription killings, I would recommend the beginning of Appian's Book 4 of his Civil Wars, where he details the killings in great length. Also, do not make the common mistake of assuming such a thing was common or accepted in the Roman world. It was deplorable to the Romans, and a blight in their history, and was not more common than it has been in our modern world, as sad as that may be. Now, back in 43 BCE, the triumvirs were still short on money despite the prescriptions. To make up the sum of some 200 million drachmas, they passed a series of laws requiring wealthy men and women to lend the government around 1/50th of their holdings. The triumvirs promised to pay them back with interest, which they actually would do, by the way, at least Octavian, that is. This caused great civil unrest, but the triumvirs managed to make it stick, and to cement the bond between Octavian and Antony, Octavian married Clodia, daughter of Antony's wife. Before I continue on to the war, however, I need to make note of the man Sextus Pompey, sometimes known as Pompeius, who was the son of Pompey Magnus, the great enemy of Julius Caesar. I mentioned him once before when Antony recalled him from exile in order to apparently receive the goodwill of the Senate, but he's still very much alive and actually garnering a reputation as a naval commander, and will soon occupy the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, which will be a problem later on for our friend Octavian. That is a side story right now, though, but it is one to keep in mind as the Second Triumvirate moves against Brutus and Cassius, because it is happening at the same time. Now, as the triumvirs had been organizing funds and preparing for an immense war, the rest of the Republic was in turmoil. There was fighting in Africa and the old lands of Carthage, piracy had returned, and Cassius was struggling to subdue Dolabella in Syria and Cleopatra in Egypt. Speaking of Egypt, the Ptolemaic kingdom was still led by Cleopatra VII, and although it was not part of the Roman Republic, it was intimately intertwined with Rome. During 43 BCE, Cleopatra had tried to actually assist Octavian and Antony in the east, but she was stalled by the presence of Cassius and the spread of famine across Egypt. Cleopatra had a powerful navy, but no army to really speak of, so Egypt was thereby in a state of recovery and not a powerful factor in the oncoming war. Brutus and Cassius, too, were desperate for money. They did not create proscription lists like the triumvirs, but I will add that they probably only did not do that because they did not have the authority or the ability to do so. It would have been impossible to enforce. And as precarious as Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus' control was in the east, the authority of Brutus and Cassius was even more turbulent. To ensure loyalty, both proconsuls were constantly moving from province to province, trying to instill loyalty and trying to draw out wealth. An example of the conspirators' ruthless nature comes from the people of Tarsus in modern-day southern Turkey. Appian writes, quote, "After Cassius had overcome Dolabella, he levied a contribution on it of 1,500 talents. Unable to find the money, and being pressed for payment with violence by the soldiers, the people sold all their public property, and after that they coined the sacred religious processions into money. This was still not sufficient. The magistrates then sold free persons into slavery, first girls and boys, after the elderly, and finally young men. Most of these committed suicide." End quote. By the way, 1,500 talents is a ridiculous sum of money. That is why they were selling themselves into slavery. And the calamity in Tarsus was not an isolated incident. It was a terrible incident, but such scenarios were frequent in the Roman East under Brutus and Cassius. The year then turned over to 42 BCE, and the war was approaching fast. And it is apparent in reading the histories that it is because of the extreme measures of the triumvirs that the forces of Octavian and Antony were able to initiate the conflict before the conspirators in the east were fully ready. Indeed, it was in the spring of 42 BCE that Octavian and Antony initiated the conflict. They took approximately 20 legions and auxiliary cavalry forces across the Adriatic Sea and landed in the northern reaches of the province of Macedonia. It seemed that the battle and war for control of Rome was to be settled once more on the plains of Greece, just as the war of Caesar and Pompey had been. Upon hearing of the departure of Antony and Octavian's fleet, Cassius returned to Brutus from Syria and made themselves ready in Greece. The two conspirators felt ill-prepared, however, to meet the combined might of the triumvirs, so they proceeded south to make war on the Rhodians, Lycians, and other people of the Greek and Ionian islands, who they sought out and defeated in great struggle because they feared that the Greek islanders would use their fleets to support the triumvirs. As Brutus and Cassius expended their energies on such small eastern kingdoms and peoples, Octavian and Antony disembarked and began to set up supply lines for their massive force. And the triumvirs were content to wait for battle in Macedonia, and they slowly marched their army in several portions across the province. The triumvirs' army then passed into southern Thrace and occupied the travel routes between Asia and Europe, taking up strategic positions near the soon-to-be famous city of Philippi. As Octavian and Antony's army formed near Philippi, Brutus and Cassius finally converged towards them. Tensions grew rapidly, and the conspirators' army was around 16 to 18 legions in strength against the combined 18 to 20 legions of the triumvirs. In real numbers, it is hard to say how many men that was, especially considering the presence of cavalry and auxiliary forces and the problematic fact that the number of legionnaires in a legion varies widely. For the sake of simplicity, I would just say that it is approximately 90,000 versus 100,000. There's really no way to be sure. It could even be double that number. And the Battle of Philippi occurred in mid-October 42 BCE, almost a year after the official formation of the Second Triumvirate. The battle occurred not in one massive engagement, but in 3 or 4 separate stages. The first stage was that of strategic maneuvers around, amongst, and on the hills surrounding Philippi and the nearby city of Amphipolis. This occurred without significant fighting until Octavian and Antony took control of the situation, dividing their forces to face Brutus and Cassius separately. Then came the second stage of the battle and the first engagement of the Battle of Philippi. Yet as soon as Octavian assumed control, he was struck by illness and relegated to his bed. Brutus was unaware of this, but nonetheless launched a fortunate attack on Octavian's legion. Octavian's forces were defeated, but the battle was not decisive and both armies returned to their encampments. And it was during Philippi that Octavian, and therefore us as well, became aware of one of his failings. Octavian Caesar was not a gifted military man. He was not a poor commander, but certainly not of the caliber of his father or Antony. And Octavian learned this of himself at Philippi. He also realized that his constant illnesses were not fit for a commander of his stature. Nevertheless, he continued on at Philippi because he had no other option. Brutus followed up his victory in the field by assaulting Octavian's camp, but luckily Octavian moved camp prior. Thus ended the second stage of the Battle of Philippi, with the conspirators' forces having the advantage after Octavian's defeat. For the third and final stage of Philippi, however, General Mark Antony was in control. And while he had many character flaws, he was at heart a warrior, a leader, and a soldier. The final battle was then pitched and was the largest of them all. But the confrontation was slow in coming because both armies were formed on separate pieces of high ground. So for over a week, the two armies stood toe-to-toe, waiting for orders and battle. Eventually, Antony managed to draw out Brutus's army and attack the exposed camp of Cassius. Brutus was unable to obtain a decisive victory to outflank Antony by eliminating Octavian's legions. Antony, however, was more successful, for he converged in a daring attack on Cassius and won a smashing victory. He forced his legions and cavalry through and put Cassius on the run. Realizing his situation and assuming the same for Brutus, Cassius committed suicide, or rather, ordered his shield-bearer to do it for him. At the news, Marcus Brutus was distraught, but maintained his battle lines temporarily. Just at this time, however, news came that the conspirators' naval forces had managed to sever supply and reinforcement lines in the Adriatic. Brutus now simply hoped to outlast the triumvirs. His officers, however, disagreed, and they urged Brutus to meet the weakened enemy in battle and be rid of them. Brutus conceded to his officers, and the two armies formed battle lines once more to settle it at last on the plains of Macedonia. Thus, on October 23rd, 42 BCE, the two armies stared each other down in the morning light, waiting for some sort of signal. Just then, two eagles soared over both camps and fought in the open space between the battle lines. Every Roman took this as a sign of the gods and watched, transfixed, as the eagles fought above. Then suddenly, the eagle that had flown from over the triumvirs gained the advantage as the other eagle fled back over Brutus's army. The legions of Octavian and Antony roared in triumph and charged into battle, sure of their victory now. The two armies then threw down their bows and javelins and met man to man, shield to shield, sword to sword in a brutal battle. The army of the triumvirs won decisively, and Brutus fled the field only to commit suicide shortly after. Thus died the two greatest of the murderers of Caesar, Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius. Octavian then exacted his revenge for his father as he had promised 2 years prior. He was ruthless in the aftermath of Philippi, attaining the heads of anyone associated with the murderers of his father. Even Octavian's own soldiers were shocked at the cold revenge that the young Caesar exacted. But he did not care. He wanted every enemy of the name of Caesar eliminated. And he granted his own wish. And the Battle of Philippi was over, thanks in large part to Antony alone. And victory was attained for the triumvirs. Subsequently, the civil war was over and the Second Triumvirate was in full control. Now, next episode with Everything History, though, you will find that the peace was to be short-lived in Rome. And if you have any questions, comments, or corrections, please email me at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.